Everyone knew John Wayne was dying, but knowing something and living inside it are two very different things. The cancer that had already stolen his lung and his stomach was now stripping away the rest of him, pound by pound, breath by breath, until the man who once filled a doorway now looked like a shadow leaning against it. At 72, Duke weighed barely 140 pounds, his clothes hanging from him like they belonged to someone else, his famous swagger reduced to careful, measured steps, and wherever he went, people stared, whispered, softened their voices, touched his arm like glass, and looked at him with the kind of pity that feels worse than pain. John Wayne could handle cancer, surgery, and fear, but he couldn't handle being treated like he was already dead. He didn't want prayers spoken in hushed tones or tearful eyes following him across a room. He wanted to be Duke, not a patient, not a farewell tour, not a living memorial. Then Dean Martin walked through his door and did what no one else dared to do. Dean looked at his old friend, took in the gaunt face and the wasted body and said, "Jesus, Duke, you look like hell. What happened? You stop eating beef?" For a moment the room froze, family holding their breath, waiting for the weight of those words to land wrong, but instead something extraordinary happened. John Wayne laughed, not a polite chuckle or a weak smile, but real laughter, the kind that comes from relief, the kind that says someone finally sees you the way you want to be seen. In that instant, Duke wasn't dying. He was himself again, because Dean Martin hadn't brought sympathy or sorrow, he'd brought normalcy. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand the bond between these two men, forged not in sentiment, but in respect. They met in 1959 on the set of Rio Bravo, when Wayne was already the embodiment of American toughness, and Dean was trying to prove he was more than a singer, more than half of a comedy duo, more than the cool guy in the Rat Pack. Wayne was skeptical at first, unsure if Dean could carry a serious role, but day after day he watched Dean deliver vulnerability and grit with effortless honesty, and skepticism turned into admiration. More than that, it turned into friendship, not the hollow Hollywood kind, but the real kind, built on mutual understanding and an absence of pretense. They worked together again, stayed in touch, crossed paths over decades, and respected each other as men who said what they meant and didn't perform for approval. By 1979, both were carrying burdens, but Wayne's was terminal. After beating lung cancer for years, it came back, crueler, spreading to his stomach, forcing brutal surgery that left him skeletal but still defiant. He refused to disappear quietly, even stepping onto the Oscar stage in April of that year. A moment meant to honor a legend, but one that instead stunned the room into silence as people gasped at how fragile he looked, applauding not the award, but the courage of a man standing in public while dying. Backstage, people swarmed him with praise and tears, telling him how brave he was, how much he meant, and every word, though kind, chipped away at his dignity, reminding him again and again that they were already saying goodbye. Dean Martin saw that moment and understood what his friend needed wasn't another goodbye, but a reminder of who he'd always been. So when Dean called Wayne's house, he didn't ask how he was feeling. He said he was coming over and joked about not dying at an inconvenient time. And when he arrived, he brushed past the careful concern and sat beside Duke like nothing had changed. For 2 hours, they did what friends do. They told stories, argued about directors, complained about younger actors, swapped insults, butchered dirty jokes, and laughed until Wayne coughed and Dean deliberately finished the joke wrong just to give him something to argue about. Cancer never entered the conversation, not because it wasn't there, but because Dean refused to let it be the only thing there. He didn't hover, didn't soften his voice, didn't treat Duke like a relic, and in doing so he gave him something no medicine could offer: dignity. When Dean finally stood to leave, there was a brief moment when everything unsaid hovered between them, all the love and grief and gratitude that could have turned the visit into a farewell. But Dean swallowed it and instead cracked another joke, because he knew that saying goodbye would take something away rather than give something back. 2 months later, John Wayne was gone, and Dean Martin stood as a pallbearer among other legends, carrying the casket of a man he loved without ever having said goodbye. When asked later if he regretted it, Dean said no, because Duke didn't need a mourner, he needed a friend. And years later, Wayne's daughter confirmed what everyone else finally understood. In his final months, Dean Martin gave her father the rarest gift of all, 2 hours of being treated like a man instead of a memory. That's what real friendship looks like when the end is near. Not making it about your need for closure, but about giving someone the grace to still feel alive. And that is why, in those final days, John Wayne didn't die feeling pitied, but remembered himself as Duke, laughing on a couch with Dean Martin, exactly the way it should have been. And that continuation matters because what happened after Dean walked out that door says everything about the kind of man John Wayne was and the kind of friend Dean Martin chose to be. Because in the days that followed, Duke's strength faded quickly, the pain grew worse, the silence in the house got heavier, but something inside him had shifted, something steadier, because he had been reminded that he was still himself, not a diagnosis, not a cautionary tale, not a tragic ending whispered about in hallways. And when nurses came and spoke softly and visitors tiptoed around him, Duke carried that memory like armor, repeating to his daughter that Dean hadn't treated him like he was fragile or fading, but like a man who could still trade insults and laugh at dirty jokes. And that mattered more than any speech or prayer, because dignity at the end of life isn't about pretending. Death isn't coming. It's about refusing to let death define the last moments. And Dean understood that instinctively, the same way he understood timing on stage or when to let a joke breathe. He knew that love doesn't always sound like comfort, and sometimes it sounds like you look like hell because it tells someone you still see them. And when Duke finally slipped away on June 11th, 1979, he didn't leave thinking the world saw him as weak or broken. He left knowing at least one person still saw Duke, still laughed with him, still challenged him. And that's why when people talk about legends, they miss the point if they only talk about movies and fame, because the real measure of a man is how he treats his friends when there's nothing left to gain. And Dean Martin gained nothing from that visit except the quiet knowledge that he had done the right thing, that he had chosen dignity over drama, friendship over farewell, and love over performance. And that is why this story endures. Not because two legends shared a final moment, but because one friend knew exactly how to make another feel alive when time was running out. And that single afternoon echoed long after Dean's car disappeared down the road, because something in Duke had shifted, a quiet peace settling where exhaustion had lived. And in the days that followed, he spoke of Dean not with sadness, but with amusement, repeating the jokes, smiling at the memory like it was a lifeline, telling his daughter that for once he hadn't felt watched or measured or mourned, only recognized. As his strength faded and the room grew quieter, that memory stayed loud, a reminder that he was still himself beneath the sickness, still the man who had filled screens and stood his ground, still Duke. When the end came on June 11th, 1979, it came gently compared to the months before, and those closest to him believed that visit had something to do with it, that being seen as alive instead of dying mattered more than anyone understood. Dean never spoke publicly about it again, never dramatized it, never turned it into a story for applause, because for him it wasn't a performance, it was instinct, the simple understanding that love sometimes means restraint. And that's why the story endures, not as a tale of death, but as a lesson in how to stand beside someone without taking anything from them, how to let a legend remain a man, and how, in the quietest way possible, to give dignity back to someone who the world had already begun to let go of. After Dean left that afternoon, the house felt quieter but lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted, and Duke sat back in his chair, exhausted yet smiling, the kind of tired that comes from actually living instead of enduring. And when his daughter asked how he felt, he didn't talk about pain or fear. He simply said, "That damn Martin still thinks he's funny," and shook his head with a grin, because for those 2 hours he hadn't been measuring time in symptoms or doctor visits, but in laughs and insults. And that mattered more than anything else. In the weeks that followed, as his body weakened and the end drew closer, that visit stayed with him, a reminder that he was still seen, still respected, still Duke. And when death finally came, it didn't erase that moment, it sealed it. Because the last gift Dean Martin ever gave John Wayne wasn't comfort or closure, it was identity. The freedom to leave this world not as a legend being mourned, not as a patient fading away, but as a man who was treated right until the end, exactly the way he'd always been treated by someone who truly loved him.